Next we have Dr. Jennifer Mascaro, and she'll talk about our final and fourth M, what matters. Finding connection in times of isolation. Thank you, Dr. Mascaro.
It's wonderful to be here with y'all. Thank you, Dr. Hackney. Thank you, Dr. Eck, for the invitation and for the wonderful organization of this. And for the three speakers who came before me with such rich presentations, I will be sharing all of these with my family. So I'm grateful for such rich information. So in the last presentation of the day, what I'd like to talk with you about is what matters to me. And it's what matters to me as a researcher and as a parent, as a child, as a partner, and that is how to find connection, especially in times when we may feel isolated. And that's of critical importance to us right now, as we are all physically isolating and distancing in order to keep our family and friends and ourselves safe and healthy. And so one of the places that we've learned most recently about isolation is actually from the UK. In the UK, there was an advocate and an organizer named Joe Cox who advocated for the government to begin to pay attention to the problem of loneliness and isolation. And they started to collect data in around 2017. And in 2018, they actually instituted a minister of loneliness to oversee this problem in the UK. And they started to collect data. And so what they found is that more than 1 in 3 people age 75 and over say that their feelings of loneliness are out of their control. Over half of parents have had a problem of loneliness, with 21% feeling lonely in the last week, or reporting that. 8 in 10 caregivers have felt lonely or isolated as they look after a loved one. Of those who experience or live with a disability, 50% say that they are lonely on any given day. And maybe most problematically, more than 1 in 10 men confessed in this survey that they are lonely but don't feel that they can or want to admit it to anyone. And so these data are a problem. It shows us the extent of the problem in our modern world of feeling isolated and disconnected and lonely. And these data are a problem from a health perspective. So this figure, I'll walk you through it because I think it's one of the most powerful scientific studies that's out there. This is a figure that represents all of the studies that have been done to look at the relationship between loneliness and mortality. So each of those dots is an individual study, and so that accounts to about 70 prospective studies. In other words, studies where they followed people over time. And the amazing thing is that accounts for almost 3.5 million people that they kind of followed over time with this research, and they followed them for an average of 7 years. And so the way to read this plot is any of the black dots that's to the right of 0 is showing an individual study showing a positive association between loneliness and an increased risk of death. And so in other words, this individual study here, not too big of an association. This study here shows a really significant association between loneliness and mortality. And when you accumulate all of these data from 3.5 million people, you start to see the impact that loneliness and isolation have on our health. And it amounts to an effect that's equivalent and in many cases more potent than these other health behaviors that we know impact our health and well-being and mortality. So that top bar is showing the data that I just showed you, kind of crunched together, and the other bars are showing the relationship between other health behaviors and mortality. So things like air pollution, BMI, physical activity, smoking, and alcohol consumption, things that we know impact our health and mortality. Well, social relationships, it turns out, is in many cases an even more potent factor for our health and well-being. And so when this study came out, there were a ton of headlines that came out with it. Loneliness as big a killer as obesity and as dangerous as smoking. You may have seen some of these headlines. And so those are the types of studies that helped inform scientists to make these kinds of claims. Now, this, as I said, is an even bigger problem now as we're physically distancing, as our frontline providers and other populations of people are inundated with stress and having to isolate for various reasons. And so in order to try to understand what to do about it, just as Dr. Morse and Dr. Rodriguez did, I began with the pessimistic side of things. But what I want to do in the rest of my time with you all is to talk about what scientists has shown us we can do about this problem. I want to begin with what is a critical distinction in this research, and that is the difference between isolation and loneliness. So far I've used them interchangeably, but they are quite different. Isolation is really that physical distance, the physical, practical, logistical disconnect that we have from people. Someone who is isolated really literally doesn't have someone that they could call if they needed them. In contrast, someone who's lonely, that's about the feeling. That's about feeling that you don't have anyone that you can turn to, feeling that maybe the world is against you. It's all about how you perceive your world. It's an important distinction, and the research that I showed you, when you look at the difference between isolation and loneliness, they both seem to independently impact health. And it's really easy to see that distinction when you look at what we're going through in our current situation. So these are data from Canada, from a big group of surveys that came out of Canada. And you can see that the blue bar, or the bluish-gray bars, are people's responses in 2019. And the red bars are people's responses in 2020. And so that you can see that, for example, the middle set of bars, more people now report that they're physically isolated but not lonely. So more people reported that in 2020 than in 2019, not surprisingly. But really potently, what is quite upsetting about these kinds of data is the people that this research study called the desolate. Those are people who reported both loneliness and isolation, sort of a double whopper, has actually increased. And that's about a third of people who are reporting that now. And so what can we do to both be and feel more connected? And I point to those two words as different things. And so what I want to do is offer some strategies for both of these things. Things that we can do to both increase our actual connections with people and things that we can do that make us feel more connected, that make us interpret our world as less out to get us and more with us. So I want to begin with a caveat, which is that this is an incredibly complex topic. The way we are feeling about our world and how connected we are is based on a ton of things that are both within and outside of our complete control. So things like our habits, our health, our income, our confidence, our emotions, things that happen at an individual level, but also at a family, at a societal, at a cultural level, all impact how much we feel lonely and also how isolated we are. So there are no magic solutions to this problem. That's why the data are so stark. So I'm not going to be able to offer a magic bullet here. But I would like to begin with the point that I think is really important, and that is that it is okay to be alone. So this beautiful picture, these are neurons from the brain of a rat. These are neurons that have been stained to become bright when the rat feels isolated. So when they isolated rats, these collection of neurons, these are neurons that sit right kind of in the brainstem of the rat, but also in humans. These neurons become highlighted and active. Really importantly, rats don't like it when these become active, not surprisingly. But even more importantly, these neurons are also the neurons that are involved in promoting the rats to then go out and interact with their rat buddies. So the first point is that loneliness can promote a rebound social ability. So as we're feeling physically isolated right now, we can imagine that this time helps promote our neurons in this area, the ventral tegmental area, to reach out and in the dorsal raphe, in the midbrain of the rat brain and of our brain, to reach out and find conspecifics or others. The other important point, though, is that there's a lot of variability when you look across humans in the extent to which we like being alone. So what is solitude to some people is loneliness to others. And I think nothing reveals that better than this amazing study that came out a couple of years ago. I'll share with you the background of this figure. So what they did was they recruited a bunch of people, and they had them sit in a room by themselves for 15 minutes. No magazine to read, no smartphone. They gave these people the option to either sit by themselves with no distraction or to receive an electric shock to their wrist. So what we're showing here is the 57% of people who were willing to sit by themselves, alone with their own thoughts, no distractions, no shocks. But a whopping 43% of people preferred to get a shock than to sit alone with their own thoughts. And so this points to the variability. So what is solitude to this 57% was loneliness and isolation, and really aversive to those 43%. So I want to begin with the point that I think is really important, to try to find the solitude rather than the loneliness in our current time or in any time. Okay, but what can we do if we want to feel more connected and be more connected? And so what we know from science is that there are some things that we can do. So the first thing that we can do quite potently is adopt a new friend. It turns out that gazing in the eyes of a dog actually releases oxytocin in our brain and in the dog's brain, really cool. The oxytocin is the neurochemical that's released when we hug a loved one, when we have a meaningful social conversation, when women give birth. This is a neurochemical that helps us feel more connected, and just gazing in those eyes helps release that neurochemical. A number of people have adopted a dog during the pandemic. That's my own pandemic puppy. We named her Quarantina or Tina. So really profoundly important way to be more connected is to adopt a puppy. If you want an excuse, here's one to do so. A second really potent thing that we can do to be more connected with our world is to volunteer. So there are a number of research studies now that show the incredible benefit that volunteering is to our health and well-being. And when scientists do the best studies on this topic, what they find is that volunteers have an approximately 25% lower mortality risk than their non-volunteering peers. That's after controlling for all kinds of factors. And this is true for both men and women. Now, really interestingly, though, not all philanthropy is equal. And so as Khalil Gibran told us, you give but little when you give of your possessions. It is when you give of yourself that you truly give. It turns out from this research that, there's a really big study that followed people over time to look at how different giving behaviors impacted mortality, especially in older adults. What they found was that time-giving behaviors were associated with lower mortality risks, but giving money was not. So it really is about giving of yourself that helps with connection and helps with health and well-being. And there are a lot of opportunities to volunteer even in our current times. And so I encourage you, and I try to remember myself, to reach out and find ways to give of myself. And the final thing is an obvious point, but an important one. We are physically, but not socially distant. And so there are many ways that our modern virtual technology negatively impacts our health, but there are also very clearly ways that we can cultivate connections, really meaningful, positive connections virtually. And sometimes this is quite difficult for populations who are not as familiar with technology, but I wanted to point to some groups that are looking into ways to simplify technology for maybe for older adults or for other populations who aren't as familiar with connecting virtually. And then the question of how to feel more connected. So remember, this is about loneliness. This is about how do we feel, how do we perceive our world as with us, as more connected, as more warm and enriching for us. So the first point is that connection, feeling connected, I think we can think of it like a muscle that we can exercise. So these photographs are of Mary Ainsworth and John Bowlby, who introduced us decades ago to the importance of attachment. They were doing research on the importance of attachment for young children, the importance of having an adult in their lives that make the child feel warmly attached to a caregiver. But it turns out that attachment is not just important for children, it's important for everyone. And really interestingly, we can prime a feeling of attachment quite quickly with an exercise called an attachment prime. And this very simply is cultivating or thinking of a time when we felt warmly held by someone in our world. Could even be a place, an environment in nature, a pet, some time that we felt warmly attached to our world. Cultivating, calling to mind that feeling and imagining it is enough in just a brief time to prime feelings of connection, and it actually changes our behavior and our health and well-being. The second muscle that we can exercise to feel more connected is our gratitude. And again, we can prime our feelings of gratitude quite quickly with what's been referred to as a gratitude prime. It's quite simply calling to mind someone, something, or a group of people that we feel gratitude for. I say to my kids, and then they say it back to me when I'm grumpy, find the flowers, not the weeds. As humans, we are fine-tuned to find the weeds in our world. We're fine-tuned to find the problems, the people to blame, but we can very intentionally find the flowers in our world, and it turns out that a very quick gratitude prime is enough to help us feel more connected. The third thing that we can do, the third exercise, is mindfulness. The exercise that we did so beautifully at the start of this event helps us sit with our own anxiety, helps us sit with the suffering of others so that we can feel more connected. And this is particularly important in a time like we're experiencing right now, where there is a lot of anxiety and suffering. The ability to be mindfully grounded in those moments helps us feel more connected, as the good chaplain told us at the beginning. And then the final thing that I think is critically important is to do things that help you think of people in their three-dimensional fullness. So we are very primed or want to think of people as two-dimensional caricatures. In other words, we think of little pieces of people and we forget their common humanity. We forget that they are a three-dimensional person with all of their intricacies and nuances just like we are. And it's amazing. The image that I'm showing here is, this is a functional brain scan where they had people in the functional brain imaging scanner, they had them view other people getting inflicted with painful shocks. And on the left was the brain of these people in the fMRI scanner when they viewed people that they considered like them, people who were in their in-group, people who they may have said is one of me. On the right is the brain of those when they were looking at people that they considered part of their out-group, someone not like me, someone in a different group, a different religion, a different culture, a different racial or ethnic group. That's what their brains looked like when they were viewing those people in pain. In other words, when we look at people as not one of us, as a 2D caricature of themselves, maybe just looking at one glimmer of that person, it changes the way our brain interacts with that person. And so we can do things to help us see people as, the common humans that they are, and to remove or at least try to mitigate this propensity to think of people as a 2D caricature. And so I want to end my time with an exercise. I think it, in some sense, bookends the beautiful mindfulness exercise that we started with the good chaplain. This is an exercise called Fields of Kindness. It's a loving kindness meditation exercise. Again, connection is like a muscle. So what I'd love for you to do, if you're in a position to do so, is settle into a chair or somewhere comfortable. You might take your glasses off or settle into the space. Lay your hands in your lap. And begin by softening your face, softening your shoulders. If you'd like, you can soften your gaze to a point in the distance or flutter your eyes closed. And begin by finding the sensation of your breath. Your breath as it goes into your nose. Wherever that breath calls to you, wherever the sensation calls to you, place your attention right there. It may be the tip of your nose or your upper lip, maybe your belly or your abdomen. Breathe in and know that you're breathing. And now I'd like you to place that attention, that awareness on your heart. Connect in with good wishes for yourself. Hold yourself with a sense of kindness and friendliness, a sense of goodwill toward your own body. Now imagine that feeling of friendliness, that feeling of goodwill, is a sphere or a field that surrounds your heart. That field may be bright, it may be golden, it may have a temperature. That field is the goodness, the friendliness that you're holding for yourself. Now you can imagine that field stretching to hold a person near you, a person in front of you, in the next room. That field of friendliness extends to them and holds them with you. And similarly, you can imagine that field grow to hold people who aren't near you, people who feel far away. And it may be difficult, but you might imagine extending that field to someone you've had difficulty with. That field of friendliness holds them along with you. And you might say something like, may we all be peaceful. May we live with ease. May we be safe from inner and outer harm. And when you're ready, you can place your attention back on your breath. That breath is always with you. And so I'm grateful to be able to share some of these insights with all of you. And I imagine there may be thoughts or questions. And if you have questions for me, you're always welcome to reach me. I'm in the Department of Family and Preventive Medicine in Emory, where we do a lot of research on some of these meditation practices and how they impact social connection and health and well-being.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mascaro. That was beautiful, and what a wonderful way to bring our time together to a close today. we see that your email is there. Did you have any questions for Dr. Mascaro?
I just want to make sure cats are good adoptive friends too.
So
I adopted 2.
you did.
I did.
So I think the jury is still out on the oxytocin and cats issue, but maybe you could do that research in your house.
Well, they make me and my family happy.
That's
so.
what matters.
That's what matters. That's what matters. That's great.
Thanks so much, Dr. Mascaro. Excellent presentation.
Thank you. What I want to do is just kind of literally we're over schedule, but just to take 2 seconds to kind of integrate. We hope that we've imparted just some basic background to you and given you the sense that the reason patient-centered care and age-friendly care puts the patient at the center and in terms of what matters, it's because you are the expert in terms of what matters for you and your health. And letting your providers, your healthcare team know that, sharing with them about your medications, as Dr. Nurse McLeod pointed out, telling them if you have the experience of having a fall, requesting a referral to a falls clinic. If you experience changes in your cognition, there are strategies out there, as we heard from some of the great research that Dr. Rodriguez is doing. And likewise, even if there aren't direct solutions out there, there are other sorts of social and biopsychosocial interventions that are available, some of which we saw illustrated by Dr. Mascaro. So as I was listening, I realized how very different or what a different take we can all take on each of these 4 M's that we discussed today, and yet how they still are very much all interconnected and lead us back to that overarching M of what matters. And so today we've heard from people with expertise in rehabilitation science, speech-language pathology, physical therapy, pharmacy, as well as social connectedness, health provider well-being. So coming from all of these different perspectives and converging, and it's very much an example of the way that we think about team-based care. And so here I just have some reiterating kinds of points about what you can do. We've already mentioned talking to your provider, asking for screenings. If you find yourself suddenly becoming confused, these are all things to seek help with. What you can do in terms of mobility, remembering that improving strength, flexibility, and balance, as well as endurance, are all ways that we can prevent falls and keep ourselves strong. And of course, we've had some excellent pointers already about medications and all of the ways in which they can influence our health as we grow older. And finally then, the what matters aspect. Again, and I'm reiterating, so maybe it's a spaced retrieval training, but be sure to talk to your healthcare team about the things that matter to you. And with that, any closing thoughts, Dr. Hackney?
Sure. Work with your care team. Make sure to get your medications right, and that can change over time. Strategize to keep your thinking sharp, and keep moving so what you can always focus on what really matters.
And with that, thank you so much, everyone. Our wonderful presenters, we thank them for sharing their expertise today, and we thank you for tuning in.
Thanks. Bye.